Mom took my stepdad's side and kicked me out, but they forgot I own the house. Now, I'm taking it back. It's funny how something meant to protect a family can be the very thing that tears it apart. My dad, who meticulously planned every detail of his life, could never have predicted how his decisions would set the stage for this mess. My name is Kyle, I'm 36, and this is the story of how I had to fight for the legacy my father left me. I work as a systems engineer for a major tech company in Denver. My dad, Mark, would have loved that. He always thought tech was the way of the future. Build your career in something that lasts, he'd say, often bragging about how I'd be shaping the world one computer program at a time. Dad himself wasn't a tech guy. He owned a construction company and poured his heart into building things that would stand the test of time. He started the business with just a second-hand truck and a few tools during the late 80s, working through one of the hardest periods the industry had ever seen. Mom once told me they lived on practically nothing in those days, barely scraping by in a tiny rented apartment. Dad never complained, though. He believed in his vision, saying, "It's not just about the buildings you create. It's about the trust you build with people." That philosophy carried him through the toughest years. While other contractors underbid and overpromised, Dad stuck to his principles, honest pricing and realistic timelines. He'd always say, "Do it right the first time, and people will come back." That's the key. Dad's company grew into one of the most trusted names in our area, known especially for restoring historic buildings with care and precision. By the mid-90s, his reputation in Denver was unmatched. Even during the 2008 recession, when construction firms were going under left and right, Dad found a way to keep every single one of his employees on payroll. He took no salary for himself during those lean years, even refinancing his prized vintage Chevy to make ends meet. Watching him navigate that crisis taught me more about leadership than any book ever could. "Take care of your people," he told me once, "and they'll take care of everything else." That lesson stuck with me. Years later, as I climbed the ranks in my own career, I found myself modeling his approach. Leading my first software team was nerve-wracking, but I used his philosophy of building trust and fostering relationships, and it worked. Around that time, I met Lily, my wife. We crossed paths at a business networking event when I was in my third year of college. Lily was studying marketing, and I was just a sleep-deprived coder trying to land an internship. I must have looked like a mess, but for some reason, she found me charming. When I introduced Lily to my dad, he loved her immediately. "That girl is solid," he said after our first family dinner. "You better not let her get away." Dad didn't just approve of Lily, he actively supported her. When she started her own business after graduation, he showed her the ropes of running a company, teaching her about contracts, negotiations, and how to network effectively. "Success isn't about keeping it all to yourself," he'd say. "It's about lifting others up with you." Lily and I settled into a routine of visiting my parents every Sunday for dinner. We'd sit on the deck Dad had built himself, watching him grill while chatting about life. Even though he didn't understand much about coding, he always asked insightful questions, genuinely curious about what I was working on. Mom would tease him, rolling her eyes and saying, "There they go, talking about computers again," but I could tell she loved it too. Dad's pride and joy wasn't just his business, it was the house he bought in the early 90s with the profits from his first major restoration project. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood of Denver, the craftsman-style home was a masterpiece of design and craftsmanship. Every detail reflected his love for the work he did. The wraparound porch, the custom wood finishes, and the garage-turned-workshop were all a testament to his skills. "This house is alive," he once told me while we cleaned out the gutters together. "Treat it right, and it'll take care of you." He wasn't kidding. Dad kept a meticulous maintenance schedule, from inspecting the roof after storms to replacing air filters regularly. He logged every improvement, repair, and coat of paint in a spreadsheet, down to the brand of screws he used. The garage was his sanctuary. He filled it with tools, each one labeled and hung in its proper place. The workshop wasn't just about fixing things, it was where he taught me everything I know about problem solving. Every piece of wood has a story, he'd say while we worked on our projects. Your job is to bring it out. Dad and I spent countless weekends in that garage working on his 1968 Chevy Impala, which he called our project. He bought it when I was 11, saying it would be a way for us to bond. He could have finished restoring it in a year if he'd wanted to, but he stretched it out over 4. It wasn't about the car, it was about teaching me patience, discipline, and the value of doing things right. Shortcuts will come back to bite you, he'd remind me. Always use the right tool for the job. That lesson carried over to my work in software. When I started managing teams, I approached coding the same way Dad approached restoring old buildings: break the problem down, do it step by step, and don't take shortcuts. When Lily and I bought our first house, a modest 2-bedroom about 15 minutes from my parents' place, Dad helped us every step of the way. He insisted we take out the mortgage in our names, saying, "It's important to stand on your own 2 feet," but he also pitched in for the down payment. Then he spent weekends showing me how to fix drywall, install fixtures, and generally handle the responsibilities of being a homeowner. By the time I became a senior engineer, Dad's health had started to decline. He shrugged it off, calling it a little wear and tear, but Mom and I worried. He was working on the biggest project of his career, a multi-million-dollar restoration of a historic building in downtown Denver, and kept putting off doctor's visits. "I'll rest when this job is done," he'd say, waving off our concerns. In hindsight, I wish I'd pushed him harder to get checked out. Dad's passion for restoration wasn't just about construction, it was his way of life. He'd often say, "Preserve the past, but don't be afraid to move forward," a philosophy he applied to everything, from his work to our family. We talked about the future a lot during those days. One of our last meaningful conversations was about the Chevy. "Let's take it to a show," he said, his eyes lighting up like they always did when he talked about cars. "We'll enter it in the Rocky Mountain Classic. Show these young guys what real muscle looks like." It was classic Dad, always planning, always moving forward. But life had other plans. It was a Wednesday morning when I got the call from Mom. I was in a team meeting, deep into the details of a software rollout. I almost didn't answer, but something made me step out and pick up. Mom's voice was shaky and panicked. "Your dad, he collapsed at the site," she said between sobs. "They're taking him to the hospital." By the time I got there, it was too late. A massive heart attack had taken him in an instant. He was only 59. The weeks that followed were a blur of grief and logistics. Dad's funeral was packed. People from every part of his life came, former employees, business partners, even competitors, to pay their respects. I heard story after story about the kind of man he was, how he'd lent tools to struggling contractors, paid for an employee's medical bills, or stayed late to teach someone the finer points of woodworking. He always said, "Business is about people," one old colleague told me. Mark lived that every day. The conference room at Dad's company turned into an unofficial shrine, filled with pictures and handwritten notes from employees and clients. Even in death, his influence was everywhere. What none of us expected was how thoroughly Dad had prepared for this moment. A week after the funeral, his lawyer, Mr. Halverson, called us in for a meeting. When he walked into the room, he was carrying a giant accordion folder labeled Family Plan in Dad's neat handwriting. Inside were dozens of documents, color-coded and cross-referenced, detailing every aspect of his estate. Mr. Halverson spent 3 hours walking me through it. "I've been doing this for 30 years, he said, shaking his head. "I've never seen an estate plan this organized. Your father thought of everything." Dad hadn't just left behind financial instructions. He'd written personal letters to each of us, explaining his decisions. He'd even created a detailed transition plan for his business, ensuring it could continue without him. When I read my letter, one line stood out. "Son, take care of what matters most. The house is your responsibility now." I didn't realize how significant those words would become. A new chapter. At first, things seemed to settle into a rhythm. Mom joined a grief support group at her church and started spending more time with the people there. She mentioned a man named Frank a few times. He was one of the group leaders and had lost his wife to cancer a few years earlier. "Frank said something interesting today," she'd tell me, or, "Frank recommended this book about moving forward." It was clear he was helping her, and while it felt a little fast, I was glad she had someone to lean on. Before long, their friendship turned into something more. Mom began going to lunch with Frank after church, then dinner. Soon, she was inviting him over to the house. Our family started noticing changes. Mom cut her hair short and started dressing differently. She tore up the garden Dad had planted and replaced it with low-maintenance shrubs. "It's time for a fresh start," she'd say whenever anyone questioned her decisions. Dad, once the center of her world, was barely mentioned anymore. 6 months after Dad's passing, Mom told us Frank was moving in. She explained it during a family dinner, with a cheerful tone that felt almost out of place. Frank's adult kids, Ben and Carla, would be moving in too. "It'll be nice to have the house full again," she said, smiling as if this was just another natural step. Ben was 30, and Carla was 32. Both had steady jobs, but they didn't seem particularly interested in finding their own place. Mom insisted it would help her feel less lonely. I tried to be supportive, but something about it didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just that they were moving into the house Dad had built with his own hands, it was the speed with which everything was happening. "She's grieving," Lily reminded me when I vented about it later. "Everyone handles loss differently. Maybe this is her way of coping." I wanted to believe that. Preserving Dad's legacy. As the months passed, it became clear that Frank wasn't just moving in, he was taking over. Little by little, he started making changes to the house. The shelves Dad had built in the living room? Frank had them torn out to modernize the space. The workshop where Dad had taught me everything? Ben turned it into a home gym, selling most of Dad's tools in a garage sale while I was away on a work trip. When I confronted them, Frank brushed me off. "We're improving the place," he said. "Your dad's style was, let's call it old-fashioned. You should be thanking us for increasing the property value." "It's my house," I reminded him, my voice shaking with anger. "Nothing happens here without my approval." Frank just smirked. "Well, your mom and I live here, and I think that counts for something." It wasn't just Frank. Carla had taken to redecorating, repainting rooms, and installing laminate floors over the carefully refinished hardwood Dad had restored himself. When I tried to talk to Mom about it, she sided with them every time. "Frank knows what he's doing," she'd say. "It's time to move on from the past." The final straw came when they removed the doorframe in the kitchen. It had been there since I was a kid, with markings showing my height over the years. Every birthday, Dad would measure me and write the date next to each line. When I saw the empty space where it had been, I felt like something inside me snapped. Mom just shrugged when I confronted her. "We can't keep every piece of wood just because it meant something to your dad," she said. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. By this point, I was at my wit's end. I had tried to stay patient for months, hoping Mom would come to her senses. Instead, it felt like every trace of Dad was being erased, piece by piece. One evening, Frank pulled me aside after dinner. "You know," he started, "it only makes sense for your mom and me to have our names on the deed." I stared at him, barely believing what I was hearing. "Excuse me? We've put so much into this house," Frank continued, his tone maddeningly calm. "With all the improvements we've made, we should have a stake in it. It's only fair." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. You don't pay the mortgage, I said evenly. You don't pay the property taxes. Everything you've done has been without my approval. This is still my house. Frank's expression hardened. Your dad isn't here anymore. It's time to think about the living. That conversation lit a fire under me. I couldn't let this go on any longer. After talking it over with Lily and consulting Mr. Halverson, I made a decision. I was going to take back control of the house. The first step was confronting Mom. During one of our weekly phone calls, I brought up the idea of them moving out. You can't be serious, she said, her voice rising. This is our home now. Steve and the kids have worked so hard to make it better. Legally, it's my home, I reminded her. I've been paying for everything, taxes, maintenance, even utilities. That doesn't give you the right to kick us out, she snapped. Do you know how selfish you sound? For the next hour, she cycled between yelling and crying, accusing me of betraying her. When she finally hung up, I felt more drained than I had in months. The next day, Frank called me. Listen, he said, his tone unusually serious. We've built a life here. You can't just come in and throw us out. Think about what this will do to your mom. I've thought about it, I replied. But I've also thought about what my dad wanted. He left this house to me for a reason. Frank didn't take that well. This is ridiculous, he muttered. We've put in sweat equity. That should count for something. It doesn't, I said firmly. As the deadline I'd given them approached, the situation escalated. Frank started sending me bills for all the improvements they had made, new floors, repainted walls, even the gym equipment in the garage. Meanwhile, Mom reached out to everyone she could think of, hoping to turn them against me. Her sister called, saying, "You need to let this go. Your dad would have wanted your mom to be happy." Frank's brother, a real estate agent, left me messages about how hard it would be for them to find another place. Even distant relatives chimed in with long emails about the importance of family loyalty. The worst part was hearing from old family friends who had known me since I was a kid. "You're making a mistake," one of them said. "Your father would never have wanted this." But I knew the truth. Dad had been clear about his wishes, and I wasn't about to let his legacy be destroyed just to keep the peace. The final straw. The breaking point came when I visited the house and saw the dining room. Frank had ripped out the original crown molding, a feature Dad had painstakingly milled to match the home's vintage style. That was it. I called Mr. Halverson that night and asked him to prepare the eviction notice. 2 weeks. That's how long I gave them to pack up and leave. When I delivered the news, Mom broke down in tears. "How can you do this to us?" she sobbed. "We've made this place a home." Frank was less emotional. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Your dad would be ashamed of you." Carla jumped in, pointing to her pregnant belly. "Do you really want to stress out your unborn niece like this?" she demanded. "What kind of person are you?" I took a deep breath, trying to channel Dad's calm resolve. "This isn't about being cruel," I said. "It's about honoring what Dad wanted. This house is my responsibility, and I'm doing what he trusted me to do." The intervention. A few days before the deadline, I showed up at the house to check on the situation. To my surprise, there were about 20 people gathered on the front lawn. Mom had recruited family members, church friends, and even some of Dad's old business partners for what could only be described as an intervention. For 2 hours, I stood there and listened as they berated me. "You're betraying your mom," one of her friends said. Another added, "Your dad would be rolling in his grave if he could see you now." The most painful moment came when Carla stood up, cradling her stomach. "This stress is dangerous for me and the baby," she said, her voice trembling. "Do you really want to hurt your family like this?" Mom sat next to her, sobbing loudly for effect. As I stood there, listening to them twist Dad's memory, something shifted inside me. I could almost hear Dad's voice. Stand your ground when you know you're right. I cleared my throat and spoke to the group. I know this is hard for all of you, I began, but my father left this house to me for a reason. He trusted me to take care of it, and I intend to honor that trust. I showed them pictures of the changes Frank had made, the cheap materials, the destruction of original features, and explained how those decisions had diminished the home's value. Finally, I read aloud a letter Dad had written to me, in which he explained why he had left me the house. His words about responsibility and preserving the past struck a chord with some of the older attendees. By the time I finished, the crowd had mostly dispersed. A few people apologized softly as they walked away. Mom and Frank went back inside without another word. The morning of the deadline, I arrived at the house with Mr. Halverson and a locksmith. I had also hired a security team, just in case things got out of hand. To my surprise, the house was already empty. Mom, Frank, and Carla had packed their belongings and left the night before. Walking through the house, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. The damage they had done was worse than I'd imagined. Builder-grade materials had replaced the original hardwood. Dad's carefully handcrafted woodwork had either been painted over or removed entirely. The workshop, once a treasure trove of tools and memories, was unrecognizable. Ben had cleared it out completely to make room for his gym equipment. I didn't plan on pursuing legal action for damages. Mr. Halverson documented everything, just in case, but all I wanted was to move forward. My focus now was on restoring what could be salvaged and preserving what remained of Dad's legacy. I reached out to a few of Dad's old colleagues, craftsmen who had worked alongside him on some of his most ambitious projects. When I explained the situation, they were eager to help. "We'll get it back to what it was," one of them promised. "For your dad." Mom moved in with her sister after leaving the house. Most of my extended family stopped talking to me altogether. The ones who did reach out weren't exactly supportive. "You've lost sight of what's important," one cousin said in a text. On social media, Carla posted updates about how unjust it was for her pregnant self to be thrown out onto the streets. The comments were full of sympathy, but over time, the posts got fewer and the responses even fewer. Through it all, Lily remained my anchor. Whenever the guilt crept in, she'd remind me of Dad's letter. "Your father trusted you to do the right thing," she said. "You're honoring his wishes, even if no one else understands." Restoring the legacy. The first project on my list was the workshop. It was where Dad taught me about craftsmanship, problem-solving, and integrity. I wanted it to be a place where I could pass those lessons on to my daughter, Emma, when she was old enough. As the weeks turned into months, the house began to feel like Dad's again. With every plank of wood we restored, every room we repaired, I felt like I was keeping a piece of him alive. Some things, of course, couldn't be undone. The doorframe with my childhood growth marks was gone for good, and many of Dad's original designs had been permanently altered. But I did my best to preserve what I could. One evening, as I stood on the deck Dad had built, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, I felt a sense of peace. Being the villain in someone else's story isn't easy, but sometimes it's necessary. Moving forward. Mom hasn't spoken to me since she left the house. The last thing Frank said before driving away was, "I hope you're happy. Your dad would be ashamed of you." I didn't respond. Dad knew what he was doing when he left the house to me. His will, his letter, and his careful planning all pointed to one thing: he trusted me to take care of what mattered most. I may have lost some relationships in the process, but I know I made the right choice. One day, I'll tell Emma all about her grandfather, the man who built things that lasted, who taught me how to solve problems, and who showed me what integrity really means. For now, though, I'm focused on rebuilding. The house will never be exactly as it was, but its spirit, the love, care, and craftsmanship Dad poured into it, will live on. As Dad used to say, doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it.